Hi, friends. Father Kerry Walters here, pastor of Holy Spirit American National Catholic Church, and this is another Holy Spirit moment. This one, a brief for rehabilitating shame as a vital moral principle. You know, the Hebrew prophets told us that every culture worships false gods. Every culture has its own idols. And it seems to me we can learn a great deal about a particular culture by examining the false gods that it worships. I think that one of the preeminent false gods of the modern age that's been around probably since at least the days of Freud is psychology. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I think that psychology is an extremely valuable science, and I thank God for it. Psychology has enabled us to explore recesses of our minds which we otherwise might never have cottoned on to. And psychology, of course, has provided us with invaluable therapies for people who are suffering from mental disorders. But it is also the case that psychology has become so highly valued in the modern age that we've tended to invest it with the religious authority that once was reserved for religion in general and Christianity in particular. So, for example, people are increasingly going to psychologists when they feel troubled instead of going to a priest or a pastor or a rabbi. People who are experiencing what tradition would have called religious crises or dark nights of the soul or feelings of guilt before God don't go to religious leaders. They now go to psychologists who promise to somehow purge those feelings from them. Don't identify them as religious phenomena, but instead label them as neuroses or even psychoses. We tend these days, in short, to genuflect before the psychologist's couch and not before the altar of God. And there are consequences to that. And one of the most obvious consequences, in my eyes at any rate, is the way in which psychology devalues and in fact demonizes shame. According to the standard psychological line today, shame is never a desirable feeling. Shame is that interior state, according to psychology, which induces within us feelings of unworthiness, feelings of inferiority. It damages the level of self-esteem that we carry around with us. And as a consequence, it's detrimental to our psychological equilibrium, our psychological well-being. We can be crippled by shame, psychologists tell us. And so we should do everything that we can to avoid it. Whenever we begin to feel stirrings of shame within us, we need to push them away and recognize that they are temptations towards a sense of inferiority. And similarly, we should never shame another person or shame a group of persons. To do so is quite awful. To do so is to damage, or at least risk damaging, another person's or a group of persons' psychological well-being. It can be an act of violence. I understand that. We all know that some people are paralyzed by an undeserved sense of shame, perhaps because of the way in which they were raised by overbearing parents, or perhaps, unfortunately, they have been beaten down in a needless and violent way by religious authorities. The 18th century Romantic poet William Blake was quite aware of the likelihood that some people can be obsessed with undeserved shame because of their unhappy church experiences. And in a rather brutal piece of verse, he writes this: "Priests in black gowns walking their rounds and binding with briars my joys and my desires." But after acknowledging that, after freely granting that shame can be misused and that shame can do bad things to an individual if the shame is out of control, I still want to suggest to you that we need to recapture the traditional sense of shame as an important ingredient in the moral life. Now, psychologists today tend not to make a distinction between shame and guilt. They see both of them as what they tend to call moral emotions, and they use the words synonymously. But that synonymity that they grant the two words is quite incorrect, at least according to the tradition. Guilt is the objective state which people fall into when they sin. Guilt is the objective state which people enter into when they commit an act of wickedness. Shame, on the other hand, is the proper interior response to guilt. Whenever we commit a genuinely sinful act, we thereby place ourselves in a state of guilt, and our proper interior response to the recognition of our guilt is shame. Now, shame isn't private or merely subjective. Shame is a product of a well-ordered conscience. Conscience is the faculty which we use to evaluate contemplated actions or to judge actions which have already been committed. If our conscience approves of those actions, and if the conscience is well ordered, then we can assume and conclude that the actions are righteous. If our conscience, on the other hand, disapproves of the contemplated or actually performed actions, and if the conscience is well ordered, then we know that we are in a state of potential or actual guilt, and the appropriate interior response is shame. Now, what I mean by a well-ordered conscience, of course, is a conscience that is rationally examining the given situation before it, and which is plugged into, is aware of universal moral principles of divine law that should regulate behavior and should be the ultimate standards for evaluating behavior, my own and the behavior of others. So, my friends, shame is not something that we ought to dismiss as a neurosis or as a breeder of unhealthy self-contempt and self-loathing. Shame is the canary in our moral mind. Shame is that faculty which clues us into the fact that we are contemplating or performing actions which make us objectively guilty because they are wicked or sinful actions. Conscience is our moral compass, and if it doesn't point north whenever we are contemplating or performing a particular action, then we properly feel shame. I wonder what it says about the culture in which we now live that we so devalue shame. If you contemplate what's going on in our world today, and particularly in our nation, if you look at all of the egregious lies and grifting that public figures perform, apparently without feeling any sense of shame whatsoever, if you read some of the comments on social media, or you look at some of the videos that people slap onto social media, you likewise get the sense that shame has completely disappeared, that we now perform actions and utter words that we would never have done or uttered in the past if our moral compasses were pointed to true north, that we have lost the ability, or perhaps better put, we have destroyed the ability to feel shame. But that doesn't make our actions any less guilty, because once again, guilt is an objective state. Guilt isn't a private, subjective determination. It is something that can be objectively evaluated, identified, and weighed. Without a sense of shame, our culture can slip increasingly into individual and collective guilt without being aware of it in the slightest way whatsoever. And when that happens, the bottom has dropped out. I fear that that state of collapse is nearly upon us right now. So, my friends, let's try to reintroduce ourselves to the traditional understanding of the moral importance of shame. I'm Father Kerry Walters, and this has been another Holy Spirit moment. Thank you so much for watching. I invite you to subscribe to the Holy Spirit Moments channel if you're not already a subscriber. And please, 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 especially now that the COVID is surging with a vengeance throughout the nation, wear your mask. Keep socially distanced from one another. Look out for the welfare of one another. Bye-bye. I'll see you next time. God bless.